Thank you, Ambassador, for talking to us. Thank you for joining Chat Lounge. And in this edition, we're going to talk about China's 20 years into the WTO and how it impacts the trade relations between Brazil and China, as well as China and the developing economies and also emerging markets. Now, in 2000, the trade volumes between China and Brazil accounted for about 3% only of Brazil's total trade volume. But then today, China is Brazil's largest trading partner. Also, Brazil is China's largest trading partner in the Latin America region. I mean, we are in a pandemic, but last year the trade volume between the two still exceeded $100 billion US. So let's start from the basics. What are the Chinese goods and services that are popular among the Brazilian people? What about Brazilian goods and services that's popular in China?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to talk to you. The history of our trade and investment relations over the last 20 years has been a success story. As you mentioned, China was still a relatively small share of Brazil's foreign trade in that time, and now it was last year responsible for almost a third of Brazil's foreign trade. And it has been a process that has been beneficial to both countries. Brazil is a big supplier to China. We benefit from China's large market. China also benefits from the fact that Brazil is a reliable supplier of a large range of commodities and products, and vice versa. Also, Brazil is a big buyer of Chinese products. The largest exports from Brazil to China are food and commodities. And in food, for instance, in beef, Brazil, in the first 6 months of this year, Brazil supplied almost 40% of Chinese imports of beef. We supply all the meats, beef, pork, and poultry. Soybeans is the largest export from Brazil, which is, of course, a crucial input to China's production of meat. And we are also big suppliers of iron ore, oil. Brazil was also one of China's largest suppliers last year. And in some other products like cotton and leather, Brazil is also a big supplier. So the two countries are very closely connected in this. China supplies a wide range of products to Brazil. The two largest ones last year were cell phones and oil platforms. So you see it's a two-way trade in which both countries support each other in a relationship which is to the benefit of their economies and to their consumers and their producers also, because we supply lots of inputs to each other.
Well, China is also one of the largest sources of foreign direct investment in Brazil. And I saw research by China-Brazil Business Council in August this year, which said from 2007 till 2020, China invested around $66.1 billion US in Brazil, and 76% of that went to the energy sector, especially in electricity.
Yeah.
Now, what factors do you think from both Brazil and China that are contributing to this steady growth of investment of Chinese companies in Brazil?
Like in many other countries, China invests in Brazil as a source of the commodities and the energy that it needs. So the oil sector is one in which Chinese companies have been very active. But a lot of this investment in electricity is also because of the size of the Brazilian market. So it's in hydroelectricity generation, in transmission and distribution of energy in Brazil. In this case, it's Chinese companies, the largest Chinese energy providers, who see Brazil as a base for operations, as their launching pad as they expand into the international market. There are also other areas in which Chinese companies have been investing in Brazil because of the potential of that market. So in the industrial sector, manufacturers have been investing heavily in Brazil. We had recently the news of a major Chinese manufacturer of automobiles who has acquired former European production facility in Brazil and is going to make a very large investment. We also have large investments in services, which are not for export, but are mostly geared towards the Brazilian domestic market. So the size of the two economies make it also profitable, and also there is this perception that this is a relationship that is for the long run. It's a place, Brazil is a place where Chinese companies can be assured that they will have a growing market with stable rules and opportunities for many years. We also hope to see more investments from Brazil into China in the coming years. We already have some important Brazilian companies which are investing in China. Of course, the flow is much larger in the other direction, but this tends to rebalance over time.
Can you tell us the name of the Chinese company that acquired the European auto?
It's Great Wall.
Great Wall. Yeah. Okay. So you're an economist, and as we were talking earlier, you served in the Brazilian mission to the WTO for 8 years. China and Brazil are two of the largest developing economies or emerging markets. Over the years, how do you think the steady growth of trade and investment between the two sides, the two countries, contributed to the world economy, especially for developing and emerging markets?
Well, already by the benefit that both our countries get from this relationship is in itself a contribution, because we are large economies. Of course, China is the second largest economy in the world, but Brazil also has a very large economy. And the contribution that this has given to reduction of poverty and to the diversification of trade and investment channels in the world is of benefit to everybody, because you get, among other things, for instance, you get scale in maritime transportation between the two countries. This benefits smaller countries in Asia and in Latin America, which can also benefit from lower costs of communication. Also by generating experiences, by the flow of people between China and Brazil with an experience in different society, different legal system. This is also both an example, but also many of these people who work in these two countries later go on to establish new businesses and new trade and new investment between other developing countries. In addition to that, these two large developing countries, precisely because we are developing countries, we have some sectors in which we are very developed, which are state-of-the-art, but we also face many of the challenges that developing countries, poorer developing countries, also face. So some of the arrangements, some of the legal constructions that we use which make it possible for trade and investment between two countries, serve also as examples for other countries to follow. So there are many benefits. Also, the fact that this trade and investment helps to diversify the traditional links that both China and Brazil had, but also that other countries in both regions, Asia and Latin America, had. They're all of benefit to the world economy.
Now, when did you start, involvement in China affairs, and over the past decades, how do you think the trade and investment, economic exchanges between China and Brazil, influence the changes in the culture and also people-to-people exchanges between the two countries?
Yeah, well, my interest in China comes from much earlier. Even as a child and as I started to work as a diplomat, I had an interest in China. But actually my professional involvement with China came in the negotiations for China's accession to the WTO. Before a country joins the WTO, it has to reach an agreement with the other main partners, and that was a process in which I was deeply involved in the 1990s. Of course, during my time in Geneva as Deputy Chief of Mission to the WTO, I had very close contacts with my Chinese colleagues. We worked together on in a range of negotiations, including the agricultural negotiations, where we had a coalition of developing countries, the G20. I think that as we mentioned before, I think that this increase in trade and investment between Brazil and China has been hugely beneficial for both countries. It has helped multiply the scale of mutually beneficial and complementary benefits that we get from this relationship. It doesn't entirely stem out of China's participation in the WTO. It has a lot to do with the reform and opening up in China itself. So the extraordinary rate of growth of China in the last 40 years, but especially in the last 20 years, of course, has generated a great number of opportunities. It has fostered, including technical progress in some areas, in the areas of commodities, for instance. The fact that prices went up because of China has been induced because of China's growth. On the other hand, the fact that Brazil has been able also to supply, because of our technology and because of our natural conditions, has been able to supply China with the amounts and the quantities and the quality that it required, also has helped China in obtaining cheaper prices for these products. So both countries have benefited enormously. In the flow of people has been mostly related to trade and investment. So there has been a huge increase in the number of Chinese residents in Brazil, for instance, mostly linked to these trade and investment opportunities or projects in the country. We have, however, the perception that actual people-to-people contacts are still well below the potential. So we would hope to get a lot more tourists, a lot more students, a lot more teachers, a lot more sports people flowing between the two countries. And of course, the pandemic has set back our plans to help advance this. But I think once we overcome the pandemic, we will definitely go back to the original plans. There are some areas also which do not have the same economic dimension between the two countries because, of course, trade and investment are huge. But even in science and technology, for instance, Brazil and China started cooperating on satellites in the 1980s. So this is an area which, to us, has always served as an example of the opportunities, the possibilities that we have, and which now have to be replicated in other areas.
Now, you said you participated in, the bilateral negotiations between Brazil and China during, China's accession to the WTO. I have to follow up on that. Do you still remember, how the interactions between you and your Chinese colleagues were, and what was Brazil's attitude back then, for China, because China wanted to join the WTO? Yeah.
Well, these negotiations are never easy, so I quite clearly remember the encounters I had. Our attitude was always very positive to China acceding, and we basically were focusing on trying to get the best opportunities in those products in which we saw huge opportunities in the Chinese market. Over time, I have to say that the pace of change in China has, on the one hand, opened up a lot of new opportunities, and on the other hand, some of the ones that we expected at the time didn't really turn up to materialize. But overall, I think that again, trade negotiations are always difficult, and each side is trying to get the best for its own interests. But on the other hand, I've always had a good interaction with my Chinese colleagues. I think that both countries appreciate that the other is a valuable partner, and therefore that we both benefit from a constructive attitude towards each other.
Right. You mentioned earlier that China's accession to the WTO almost happened. After China's reform and opening up, but it's almost at the same time in the same direction. The Chinese government in recent years have said on many occasions and for several times that they intend to further open up the Chinese economy. What opportunities does Brazil see in this?
Well, in the case of trade, of course, for us, given that China is our largest trading partner, we consider it as a key element of our foreign policy and of our foreign trade policy objectives to make the most of these opportunities. We are already benefiting because we have seen an expansion of our exports to China, for instance. There are challenges in a good sense, in the sense that are tasks that we have to undertake in order to make the most of the opportunities that the Chinese market offers. Some of them have to do with the policies, some of them have to do with the fact, for instance, that rising incomes in China demand different kind of products. So we are set on offering more sophisticated products. In the case of the food industry, for instance, the Chinese are all the time demanding higher quality products. And also in expanding or creating new markets which were not so traditional. To give you an example, beef, for instance, was not such a large import in China, but China is the fastest growing large market for Brazilian beef recently. So we follow the policies, but also the economic and social trends in China to make the most, to try to benefit. We want to continue to be China's partner in this, and we think it's to the benefit of both countries. In the case of investment, we have a history which is much shorter. The amounts of investment that you mentioned have risen in the last 8 or 9 years. So it's very recent still. But we see a huge potential because China has the capital and also the interest in sending its companies abroad to make the most of the opportunities, both in the domestic markets, and I said Brazil is a huge domestic market, but also to ensure that it will be able to keep the flow and at competitive prices of the commodities and the products that it demands from the outside world.
Right. You are an expert on WTO and on trade. The reform of the WTO has been debated around the world for a long time, but consensus are pretty rare, especially in the areas of one country, one vote decision-making process, and also the reform of the appellate body. So China and Brazil are both developing economies. What do you think are the common interests or appeals of the two countries in WTO reform, and how can the two work with each other to influence the rules-making process of WTO?
Yeah, the WTO, like most multilateral organizations, is going through a difficult moment because of a lack of, one might say perhaps a commitment or at least the willingness on the part of all to contribute to multilateralism. Multilateralism is not easy because you really have to accommodate the perceptions of others and bring it into contact with domestic decision processes. And you have to make concessions, and it's not easy to explain this not always easy to explain it to the domestic public. But on the other hand, multilateralism, in spite of being so slow and difficult to negotiate, is in many ways the most efficient process to deal with issues that affect everybody. So one of the first multilateral organizations was the International Postal Union. Now, if you had to negotiate with each country how you're going to send a letter to them, of course, maybe perhaps the negotiation is easy, but the end result is much less efficient than having an agreement in which all participate. Now, nowadays we have not only trade, but so many other processes in which there is a growing overlap of competences. If you look even at something negative like cybercrime, it's difficult to combat cybercrime exclusively from one country because these flows have the influence or generate from other countries. In the case of the pandemic also, it's obvious that if we can collaborate, we will achieve much sooner a much better result than everything else. But going back to the WTO, I don't really see an alternative to consensus as the decision-making rule in the WTO, because we are talking here about reaching agreements that will impact policy making within each country. So it's, if we are going to decide on what will be the tax policy or what will be the standard for protecting consumers in our country, it's difficult to see any country, no matter how small or how large, accepting that this standard will be decided by others against its will. And consensus ultimately also defends the large countries. Sometimes the large countries have the illusion that there will be a system in which they can decide what others will do, but they will have a large enough vote so that they will prevent others from deciding for them. This may work, for instance, in a bank, in a multilateral bank, in which the one who has the money can have a larger share of the vote than the ones who don't have the money. But in the case of policy making, when you're deciding what each country will have to decide on things which are ever more essential, like, again, the quality, the protection of life, the protection of health, migration policies, it's difficult to envisage something that will substitute a qualified voting or majority voting. I don't think would really work in this case. Now, of course, the WTO hasn't been working well. There is a paralysis in decision making. There's a paralysis in the negotiations. These things can only work, and we now have a history of perhaps 200 years in multilateral organization, when there is really a commitment to get things moving. And this requires a lot of understanding, a lot of discussion, a lot of trust in each other. We, unfortunately, are at a moment in which these elements are lacking. I remain convinced that we will ultimately go back to these multilateral negotiations because they are better for everybody. Sometimes the large countries also have this illusion that they can use their power better on bilateral negotiations and impose their will. Actually, as I said, I don't think that it's an efficient process because we often see examples in which the large country cannot prevail over the smaller country because the issues are much more central, perhaps, to the smaller country. And therefore, I think that at some point we will need to get back to multilateral rulemaking. Brazil and China have an important role to play in this. First of all, because in spite of being developing countries, we're also large economies. So we have a range of experiences and situations that we face that in some ways are similar to what the developed countries have, in some ways are similar to what the smaller, poorer countries have. So we have, I think that we are better prepared perhaps to devise solutions or make proposals that cater to the extremes. Things which are not just for the very rich, things which are not just for the very poor. So, and also we also have more sophisticated bureaucracies than some of the smaller developing countries. So I think Brazil and China have an absolutely essential role to play, and I think we will both benefit from continuing the tradition that we have of constructive engagement bilaterally, but also in the multilateral organization.
Well, that's about the WTO reform. Right now, we're in a pandemic, and Brazil and China have been working with each other very closely from the very beginning in fighting against COVID. The phase 3 clinical trial of Sinovac vaccines are now being conducted in Brazil. How do you evaluate these cooperations, and what more can the two sides do, in the areas of public health?
Yeah, well, as you said, not only Brazil and China collaborated in the case of the Sinovac vaccine, which enabled Sinovac, which was a relatively smaller company in China at the time, to play such a decisive role in vaccination, not only in Brazil, but even in China and in other developing countries. So I think that this was a very good example of cooperation, South-South cooperation. Also, another vaccine which has been extensively used in Brazil is the AstraZeneca. But the active ingredient for the AstraZeneca was actually provided for several months by a Chinese company. So Chinese-made active pharmaceutical ingredient was the key element of the first phase of the Brazilian vaccination program. And the results have been very good, because since we started actively vaccinating, this has led to a major reduction in cases and death in Brazil. So we are very happy with what the cooperation we have had. I also think that this has laid the basis for closer contacts between the industries and the authorities, the health authorities of both countries. So from now on, unfortunately, I'm afraid this will not be the last pandemic we face. And on top of that, we still have a large number of important diseases which perhaps will benefit from the technologies that were developed for the COVID vaccines. So overall, in spite this whole situation being quite tragic, I think that the cooperation between Brazil and China has been exemplary, and we are very positive about prospects for future development. There is at least another Chinese developer of a vaccine which is also conducting phase 3 trials in Brazil. So I think that this is the beginning of a long road. These diseases, traditional diseases, tropical diseases that I mentioned, have affected every year more people than COVID has. So maybe some good will come out of it if we can reach faster vaccines, for instance, for malaria, which not only in South America, but above all in Africa, is a very dangerous disease. So I think this is one of the areas in which we will be diversifying in a good way our bilateral relationship. Unfortunately, the pandemic was also an example of the multilateral arrangements not working so well. So we would have had a much better result if we had multilateral processes that were working more efficiently and with better trust and cooperation among all parties.
Well, I have one more question about the pandemic, because in June this year, BRICS countries had a ministerial meeting where the statement coming out of which said BRICS countries support the WTO consideration of an IP waiver of the vaccines. How possible is that, do you think? And what can Brazil? I mean, what are the advantages of Brazil and China as developing economies in setting the agenda for vaccine IPs?
Yeah. The thing is, on the one hand, it's important because this is obviously one of those cases in which it's clear, given the scale of the emergency, of the health emergency, that IP rules should not stand in the way of getting as fast as possible the largest supply possible of vaccines to everybody. On the other hand, the waiver is not in itself a sufficient condition for really enabling everybody to produce this. The production techniques and the materials that are required and the practices, the kind of laboratory and production facilities that you need for this are not easily copied. So the waiver is not in itself sufficient. So I think we should go on. I hope that there will be progress with regard to the waiver in the negotiations in the WTO. But it's not a substitute and above all, it's not enough in the absence of actual cooperation between the companies that have the ability to produce these vaccines and the other countries. And of course, we're happy that Chinese companies have been willing to invest in production in other countries, and I think that's the way forward for this.
Well, Brazil and China have participated for quite a long time now in several intergovernmental organizations representing the interests of developing and emerging markets, such as BRICS and also New Development Bank, as well as AIIB. Now, how do you comment these, the development or the results of these cooperations, and what can the two do? What more can the two do, to really protect the interest of, the developing world?
Yeah, well, I think the institutions that you mentioned, the New Development Bank, the AIIB, have been major contributions. They have changed, in fact, the scenery and the prospects for developing countries when it comes to access to investment, not just in infrastructure, but in many other areas, including now with the pandemic. These institutions have provided absolutely urgent and much needed finance to help governments respond to the pandemic. The speed with which the NDB was decided and created and put into operation and already approved very large volumes of investment is also an example. It's a lean structure. It has been very efficient. It has filled the gap in terms of supplying credit for developing countries. And I think it has also the added benefit of diversifying away from multilateral institutions, which in some cases, because of weighted voting, have tended to reflect the views of a small number of countries, which are not any of them developing countries. So I think this has been also one of the main areas of cooperation between Brazil and China, of which we, both countries, must be proud of, and which is providing a major contribution, not only to both countries, but to a large number of developing countries.
One more question. Earlier you said multilateralism is having a hard time or a tough moment now. As two large economies, as well as sort of representatives of the developing world, what can China and Brazil do to just make sure that multilateralism can play its role, in the future for the international community?
Yeah.
Because we have seen a lot of anti-globalization sentiments, as well as protectionism, in some parts of the world.
Yeah. I wish there were a short answer to that, but it's not easy, unfortunately. But the thing is that globalization, as a phenomenon, is not something which is necessarily driven by governments. It's not a decision that we make. The increase in contacts, the flow of culture, the progress of technology, all of these are drivers of globalization. As they happen, and the way the scale of economic activity, the way ideas flow, they all end up generating opportunities and problems which cannot be dealt with just by individual governments. So we need at some point more cooperation between governments to find common solutions. Until we do, until the moment is right for that, until all countries decide, perhaps they have to try by themselves, see how they can individually try to find the solutions for these problems, which are ultimately affecting the whole world, just like the pandemic. The pandemic, in some ways, I think, will teach us a lesson, unfortunately, an expensive lesson. These lessons are always expensive. Now, Brazil and China, I think that what we have to, first of all, is to reinforce our commitment about the willingness to engage with others to find common solutions to common problems. We have to try to understand the perspectives of each other, the perspectives of other countries. And as I said earlier, I think the fact that we are countries with unequal development within our societies in some ways makes it easier for us to understand some of these problems, precisely because also domestically we have to find solutions that are adequate to people and to companies in very different circumstances. So I think we have a major contribution to give. We should always be ready to engage with a view to finding common solutions to common problems.
So to sum up, there will be difficulties ahead still in the coming years, but we should keep the hopes up, right?
Absolutely. And on top of that, we also have every day to make the most of the opportunities. In the case of Brazil and China, there are so many opportunities. As we have seen, our trade has multiplied by 30 in 20 years. And I see no reason why we cannot keep expanding trade and investment between the two countries. I see a huge interest both in China and in Brazil for an increase in people-to-people contact, which unfortunately is now being hampered by the pandemic. But for instance, the interest that I see in Brazil about learning Mandarin, and inversely by the Chinese about learning Portuguese, is something which fills me with hope. We have much to learn from each other. Of course, we have very different social and political and legal systems, but on the other hand, I see so many points of contact and a common humanity between the two countries. There is a lot of sympathy between the two peoples that we think is very promising for the future.
Well, thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.